De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Deep within the subconscious of the black man in this country, he's still more African than he is American. He thinks that he's more American than African because the man is jiving him and the man is brainwashing him every day, telling him, you're an American, you're an American. Man, how could you think you're an American and you haven't ever had any kind of American treat over here? You have never. 10 men can be sitting at a table eating, dining. And I can come and sit down where they're dining. They're dining. I got a plate in front of me, but nothing is on it. Because all of us are sitting at the same table, are all of us diners? I'm not a diner until you let me dine. Then I become a diner. Just being at the table with others who are dining doesn't make me a diner. And this is what you got to get in your head here in this country. Just because you're in this country doesn't make you an American. And no, you got to go farther than that before you can become an American. You got to enjoy the fruits of Americanism. And you haven't enjoyed those fruits. You've enjoyed the thorns. You've enjoyed the thistles, but you have not enjoyed the fruits. No, sir. So I point these things out, brothers and sisters, so that you and I will know the importance in 1965 of being in complete unity with each other, harmony with each other, and not letting the man maneuver us into fighting one another. I say that again that I'm not a racist. I don't believe in any form of segregation or anything like that. I'm for the brotherhood of everybody, but I don't believe in enforcing brotherhood upon people who don't want it. As long as we practice brotherhood among ourselves, and then others who want to practice brotherhood with us, we practice it with them also. We're for that. But I don't think that we should run around trying to love somebody who doesn't love us. Thank you.
Long live the amazing Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, one of my favorite revolutionaries of all time. Always has such inspiring, amazing words. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 84, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, the Farce of July, or the Farce of July, aka the 4th of July, that many people are celebrating this weekend. I'm certainly not celebrating it. You're probably not celebrating it. But everywhere we go, we're seeing these U.S. flags and patriotism and white nationalism on the rise and fascism on the rise. Today, we're going to expose the historical roots of the 4th of July and the so-called American Revolution. We're going to discuss the racist, capitalist, and settler-colonial origins of this project, this entity known as the United States. we're going to talk about and expose how the preservation of slavery was a motivating force for what some call the Revolutionary War of 1776 and the so-called Founding Fathers, how the creation of this project known as the United States led to the systematic oppression and genocide of African and Indigenous peoples, and also lastly, modern attempts to whitewash, to gloss over, to rebrand, to revisit the history of the so-called American Revolution. And joining me today is hands down one of my favorite historians, a people's historian, somebody who I have tremendous respect for. I have so many copies of his book. You all know him, Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne has written more than 30 books, including the book that we're going to be discussing today, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, The Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. He's also the author of The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler-Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, and White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you so much for joining me. It's an honor to have you on the stream.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. And I want to also give a shout out to our good friend, our sister, Margaret Prescott, Sojourner Truth with Margaret Prescott, who I've worked for many years. Margaret is somebody who I have so much inspiration for. She actually put me on to your work, Dr. Horne. And as soon as I started listening to you on the Friday roundtables, as soon as I started hearing your commentaries, I was like, I need to get this guy's books. I bought your books and amazing, amazing stuff. The last one that I finished was White Supremacy Confronted. And that is just such a beautiful history of the solidarity, because a lot of times we get such of the negative aspects of the history of like colonialism and European settlers. But it's beautiful to see the solidarity between the Cuban Revolution and the African peoples, and especially in Namibia and Botswana and Southern Africa, to see that solidarity against oppression. So your books are amazing. I highly suggest people check out Dr. Horne's books. What I want to really get into, Dr. Horne, today is the so-called 4th of July. Tell us exactly, first of all, if you want to discuss a little bit about what is the common perception of the 4th of July? What is the common narrative that we hear? And what is your understanding of it based on your research and historical evidence?
Well, the common understanding, including, I'm afraid to say, by some of our friends on the left, is that the secession from the British Empire, led by slaveholders embodied in one George Washington, was a great leap forward for humanity. Of course, they elide and glide past the obvious point, which that by several orders of magnitude, the African population did not engage in class collaboration with their slave masters. And the same holds true for a goodly number of indigenous groupings. In order for 1776 to make sense, and this is a particularly egregious error on the part of our friends on the left, you have to eviscerate the notion of class collaboration. What I mean is that if you look at settler-colonialism, the 16th century book that I believe you mentioned, talks about the origins of England's settlements in what they call North Carolina in the 1580s. It was a class collaborationist project from the inception. The 1% sponsor the non-affluent, with the mutual gain being seizing the land of the Native Americans and stocking the land with enslaved Africans. And to get to the present, you cannot begin to understand how Donald J. Trump got 74 million votes without understanding class collaboration. It's mathematically imprecise, to put it mildly, to suggest that 74 million in a country of 330 million constitutes the 1%. That doesn't compute. Obviously, just as on January 6, 2021, you had CEOs, you had shopkeepers, you had military veterans, you had cops, you had workers, almost all of European descent. And so in order to make the United States make sense, you have to really bury that idea of class collaboration. And then, perhaps even worse, you have to impute class collaboration to the community of African origin that is engaged in class struggle. That is to say, that even today, the descendants of enslaved Africans vote against the right by a higher percentage than any other demographic, 8-2 to 9-1. And as already noted, they did not support the process that led to an escalation of the slave trade, speaking of the formation of the United States of America. And so what's even particularly pernicious about many of our friends on the left is that what is in essence a kind of class solidarity by the descendants of workers who were not paid, speaking of those we call slaves, it's slapped with what is intended to be derisive. That is to say, this is all identity politics. And what's interesting about this term identity politics, I get they hardly ever put flesh on those bones, but I assume they're talking about something like Black Lives Matter. So we're not supposed to protest when we're shot down like dogs in the streets. We're not supposed to engage in any kind of solidarity. Now, if they were to be consistent and to say the B'nai B'rith of Anti-Defamation League or the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee, that's identity politics because it's Jewish Americans coming together. No. They do not say that. I mean, it's just so ludicrous. And then people wonder why we're on the brink of fascism, why we now know that the 45th US president on January 6th intended to unleash an armed mob against Congress. The only thing missing from the story is that Mr. Trump did not have a white horse stashed off stage that he would ride down Pennsylvania Avenue leading the protesters. We now know that in light of the decision overthrowing Roe versus Wade, that certain Republican extremists are now suggesting that women who have abortions should be subjected to the death penalty. Now, what kind of country is that? If this was some great leap forward for humanity in 1776, if this was some great experiment in small d democracy, well, then how did we get to this point? Of course, these people have no answers except a subjective answer, which is that, oh, Donald J. Trump is a bad guy. Okay, fine. We can stipulate that he's a bad guy, but that is not a factor that unravels the historical process. That's by pointing to one individual. That's the essence of subjectivity. And let's hope that we can do better before we're discussing these matters in concentration camps.
Most definitely. Amazing commentary there, Dr. Gerald Horne. I definitely agree. I think that people who like to gloss over the brutal and racist history of the foundations of the U.S. and trying to sort of mend these wounds without really addressing things like reparations, we can't move forward as a working class, as oppressed peoples, without giving what's owed to African peoples, indigenous peoples who were murdered, enslaved, kidnapped, had their land stolen from them. And it's really disappointing to see some sectors of the left who want to just write that off as identity politics. I've even seen some people who will say that millionaires and billionaires are funding these movements as a way to try to destabilize and balkanize what they refer to as America. And it's important to defend land back. It's important to defend reparations, because without addressing these issues, we can't begin to move forward. The reason why there's so much poverty in indigenous communities and African communities and Latino communities is because of these historical origins. And we really have to go back in time to understand that. And so what I want to just quickly do, I actually want to read a description of your book, which again is The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. This is from the NYU Press website. This book illuminates how the preservation of slavery was a motivating factor for the Revolutionary War. The successful 1776 revolt against British rule in North America has been hailed almost universally as a great step forward for humanity, but the Africans then living in the colonies overwhelmingly sided with the British. In this trailblazing book, Gerald Horne shows that in the prelude to 1776, the abolition of slavery seemed all but inevitable in London, delighting Africans as much as it outraged slaveholders and sparking the colonial revolt. Prior to 1776, anti-slavery sentiments were deepening throughout Britain and the Caribbean. Rebellious Africans were in revolt. For European colonists in America, the major threat to their security was a foreign invasion combined with an insurrection of the enslaved. It was a real and threatening possibility that London would impose abolition throughout the colonies, a possibility the founding fathers feared would bring slave rebellions to their shores. To forestall it all, they went to war. The so-called Revolutionary War, Horne writes, was in part a counter-revolution, a conservative movement that the founding fathers fought in order to preserve their right to enslave others. And I think this is such an important book to read because the narrative that we get, and I'm just going to quickly also play a clip from our favorite mainstream media propaganda channel, History Channel, which has so much distorted nonsense about the U.S. The common narrative is that, you know, the American patriots were the good guys, that they were against systems of exploitation, not that they were trying to maintain slavery, right? And a lot of times people warp that as saying, oh, are you defending the British, or are you? It's like, no, we can point out the errors of the British Empire and British colonialism. But what we're saying is that the intent of the so-called American patriots was not justice and liberty. It was to maintain their slaveholding system. So I'm just going to quickly play this clip, and then we'll continue talking and delving deeper into the actual history of what happened in 1776.
We wouldn't be here without the Revolutionary War. And I've gone back recently in my own personal readings to try to understand more about that. How brave they were. And they were not just brave in a military sense. They were intellectually brave.
The people who were in the forefront of the revolution were people engaged in commerce, because they felt most specifically and directly British interference, British taxation and limitations.
It's very interesting to think about the foundation of the nation and the fact that the country was born out of revolution, and that sort of rallying spirit of win, win, win and fight back the oppressors persists.
We were effectively guerrilla fighters. We were not the Redcoats, after all.
Two things. Number one, memo to the British forces, ixnay on the red suits. That was probably not tactically the best move. Number two, if you're going up against guys who are using blankets for shoes in the middle of winter, bring your best game, because they'll open a can of early American whoop-ass on you.
The American Revolution, in one sense, is an example of a war in which the weaker contestant prevails because it is more determined to persevere.
It's almost the little man syndrome. We've always felt a little undersized, a little underappreciated, and I think whenever you're able to take those feelings and manifest them and to try to do something that's positive, to try to do something that's competitive, you give yourself a lot better chance of being successful.
The British Army was fighting for a king. The Americans were fighting for their lives. And it's not so much how much equipment you have or how much training you have, it's what's in your belly, it's what's in your heart. And you know you're fighting for your lives and a way of life, as opposed to fighting for a monarch who you may not care about or may not love, but it's your job. That's all the difference. You're going to fight harder if you're fighting for your own way of life. You're fighting for your families.
Back then, during the Revolutionary War, what really made the difference is they really believed in what they were fighting for. That's why the Americans actually had the advantage.
This is a case of hanging on in the face of the British actions long enough to where the British literally would grow weary of this and realize that it was endless. They could not prevail.
In the last analysis, the British were willing to cut a deal with the Americans in order to make sure that they could preserve their power in Europe.
Any American who wants to know what it takes to be free should study the Revolutionary War.
So a lot of delusion there. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way, to Comrade Erica Keynes, to Manny Nile. Manny Nile said, I've watched this before. I used to be addicted to the History Channel and National Geographic. It's programming, racist propaganda. Dr. Gerald Horne, your reaction to this narrative of the 4th of July?
Well, first of all, having Newt Gingrich be one of your spokespersons, that's not the wisest choice in terms of a talking head. There's so much that's delusional and wrong, I hardly know where to begin. First of all, with regard to Daniel Howell's point, there is something to this idea that with regard to the split between the 13 colonies in London, part of it had to do with the growth of productive forces on this side of the Atlantic. And the capitalists on this side of the Atlantic felt that they were constrained by London, not least because they wanted to deal with the French in the Caribbean, what is now Haiti. In fact, when you look at the Haitian Revolution and the amazing influx of Africans into the Caribbean, which would then also include the Dominican Republic, before the revolution culminates in 1804, a lot of it has to do with U.S. capitalists and their attempt to work out a deal with London's antagonists, meaning of France. So that is a factor in leading to the rift. But you cannot begin to understand the rift between London and the 13 colonies without understanding slavery. In 1772, in Somerset's case, London had moved to abolish slavery. In England itself, a decision that quickly spread throughout the British Isles. There was a real fear amongst the slave owners, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, let's deal with the class question after all, that this decision would leapfrog the Atlantic and jeopardize their fortunes in the bodies of enslaved Africans. Likewise, there's the Royal Proclamation of 1772-1763, where London expresses displeasure at continuing to fight Native Americans, take their land, and then turn it over to real estate speculator number one, being George Washington. And the settlers railed against that, and that was another cause for the revolt. So in other words, there are material factors. I address this particularly to the left because supposedly the left, at least some of them, believe in the concept of materialism. It's material factors, land and labor, that leads to the rift, that leads to 1776. And I should also mention that this idea that just because the Africans did not engage in class collaboration and sided with London, that is discrediting. Well, I guess that it's discrediting to the United States that they sided with Stalin in 1942 to fight Germany and Japan. So maybe, you should excoriate Churchill and Roosevelt. See, these people, they're so inconsistent. They'll do anything to be on the same side. And I'd say this particularly to people on the left. They'll do anything to be on the same side as Washington and Wall Street. But when it comes to the oppressed, they have these exacting standards. Now, with regard to land back, with regard to reparations, particularly the latter, I would hope that the left does not believe that people should work and not get paid. I mean, as we speak, the courts are clogged with cases, interestingly enough, in a former slaveholders' republic, of workers saying that they were subjected to wage theft, that they worked and didn't get paid. I hope that people feel that they should win their claims, that they should be paid. Likewise, if you've had centuries of wage theft with regard to Africans, don't be fooled. Don't let your Afrophobia come out just because people with dark skin, you can't relate to it. Look at the class question, because that's what supposedly you people say you do. Look at the class question and say, we think workers should be paid. It should be a very simple question. And I should also say that but for the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, this horrendous process might have extended indefinitely. But it was the Haitian Revolution that ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse. Once again, in some ways, it was a workers' revolution, except that the workers weren't getting paid. And I thought that many people liked the idea of workers' revolution. At least that's what I've been told. But that helped to induce London to fear that its cash cow in neighboring Jamaica would be jeopardized. In fact, if you look at the Haitian Revolution, as I talk about in my book on the Haitian Revolution, it was a Jamaican bookman who actually lit the fuse on August 1791 that led to an island-wide conflagration. And so London decides that the jig is up. They begin to retreat from the slave trade, abolish slavery circa 1833. The slave holders, the so-called good guys in North America, they dig in their heels. It takes a bloody civil war involving the deaths of about 800,000 people in order for slavery to be abolished. And then, these people on the left, they're supposed to be internationalists. Okay, fine. You have a control group. Canada did not have a revolution. It's right across the border. In fact, many of the people who didn't want to join the revolt against British rule fled to Nova Scotia, fled to Ontario, fled to Quebec. And yet Canada today has a single payer healthcare system, which is an emblem of caring for your populace, whereas the United States has this pay or die system. Now, of course, when you bring that up, then the US patriots, including those on the left, say, oh, you think Canada's a great country, huh? Einstein, I'm talking about a theory of relativity. I'm talking about relative capitalism. Please, use your head for something besides a hat rack.
I love that. It's such a good point. I think that unfortunately people especially within the left, and I notice this within modern attempts to organize the white working class in the US, try to play these mental gymnastics and try to change what the definition of, first of all, of US history. They try to revise what actually happened and real injustices that were committed against African and Indigenous peoples, but also try to have this approach where anything that is in defense of your people or in defense of sovereignty that is not necessarily 100% based on class is just liberal identity politics. It's just regarded as something backed by George Soros. It's regarded as something that's backed by the NGO industrial complex. And to a certain degree, we have to admit that those forces do exist. But I think it's important if we study the history of the real revolutionary left, especially the internationalist left, the national liberation question is a class question. And I think the Haitian Revolution is such a great example of that. The Haitian Revolution was a class liberation movement of the working class Africans who were kidnapped, revolting against French colonialism. And without that amazing Haitian Revolution, there wouldn't have been the revolutions that took place in Latin America and the Caribbean that also revolted against the Spanish Empire. And I think that's important to point out. And, one thing I wanted to ask you, Dr. Horne, is that within the efforts to mold sort of U.S. patriotism and white Euro-American nationalism with socialism or the left, there's an attempt to, I want to give a shout out to my comrade Onyesanwu with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. She has a really great, a term that she uses called flattening the contradictions, where they'll say, oh, well, in Haiti, they look up to Toussaint and Dessalines. In South America, they look up to Bolivar. And, in Mexico, we look up to Vicente Guerrero. Why can't we do the same in the U.S.? Why can't we, look up to George Washington, look up to Thomas Jefferson? Break down for us who exactly were the founding fathers, right? And why were they different from these actual revolutionary figures in the global South, who are national heroes, but also come from a different class strata, right? If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Toussaint and Dessalines, who are given credit, understandably, for the abolition of slavery, in fact, igniting, as noted, a general crisis of the entire slave system. You mentioned Vicente Guerrero, also of African descent, by the way, the president of Mexico in the 1820s when slavery was abolished. Of course, in the so-called Revolutionary Republic, of the United States of America takes 2 centuries later before they're able to elect a president of African descent. He, of course, was responsible for abolishing slavery. Whereas if you look at these so-called founding fathers, they were slave owners. They weren't abolitionists. I mean, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson is a leading draftsman of this document, he's excoriating London for inciting so-called, quote, domestic insurrections against the settlers. That is to say, insurrections of the Africans, the enslaved, and the indigenous population. Thomas Jefferson, as is now known, based upon subsequent research, could easily be called a slave molester. I mean, look at his relationship with Sally Hemings, for example. George Washington, towards the end of his life, he owned hundreds of Africans. Look at the story of George Washington and Ona Judge, O-N-A-J-U-D-G-E, this Black woman, enslaved person who escaped from his jurisdiction, and he moved heaven and earth to make sure that she would come back. So if people are looking for heroes in North America, there is a plethora of heroes and heroines to look for. Now, if you want to be an opportunist and just sign on to settler-colonialism because you're afraid of crossing swords with this right-wing populist sector in the United States, which is about on the verge, they tell us, to execute women who exercise freedom over their bodies, well, be my guest. But be sure that you're being honest with yourself that that's what you're doing. You're just engaging in opportunism, of which there is a long and sorry record in this country, I'm afraid to say.
Most definitely. Sorry, I was muted. Most definitely, Dr. Horne. I couldn't agree more. And also, I want to give a shout out to my comrade, Salifu Mack. Lots of opportunists out here on the left, Dr. Horne. Exactly, 100%. I think that's a great way of putting it, because you're trying to play these mental gymnastics of warping what, socialism and what progressivism means, and molding it with this racist reactionary approach and understanding of history. Also, shout out to my comrade Josh Finn in upstate New York, going through Dawning of the Apocalypse by Dr. Horne right now and learning more and more every day. Can't wait to continue reading the rest of the series. Such a great book. Dawning of the Apocalypse is an amazing book by Dr. Horne. What I want to do is I want to play another clip. This is another one of our favorite institutions, right-wing propaganda machines known as PragerU, rewriting history, putting out. And here's the thing with PragerU is that they actually have millions and millions of views. And unfortunately, even within Black and Brown communities, I had somebody on the construction site the other day come to me and I was like, oh, I'm learning about history, this great channel. I'm like, what channel is that? He's like, PragerU. I was like, oh my God, unsubscribe, turn that garbage off. But they're so efficient at putting out propaganda. This is one piece of propaganda they put out. PragerU, it's called "What Was Revolutionary About the American Revolution." I'm going to play this and then we'll get some more reaction from Dr. Gerald Horne.
The birthday of a new world is at hand. That was what Thomas Paine, the fiery pamphleteer, wrote in 1776, as 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies rose in revolt against British rule and declared themselves a newly independent nation. The American Revolution was something the world had never seen, politically, economically, and diplomatically. Let's look at all three. First, the politics. Revolutions themselves were not new, of course. Britain put itself through not one, but two revolutions in the 17th century. Other countries in Europe endured similar upheavals. These rebellions shared one of two goals: replace the current monarch with another one, or extort new protections and privileges from the existing regime. In stark contrast, the Americans did not propose merely overthrowing a monarchy. They proposed ending the very idea of monarchy as a worthwhile form of government. In America, the citizen, not the government or the king, would hold the keys to power. With this overturning of the old way of doing things, the rebels made the political systems of Europe look as antiquated and irrational as fully as Newton's laws had made medieval physics look antiquated and irrational. As it was with politics, so it was with economics. Tearing up the old order meant more than just refusing to take political orders from kings, dukes, and princes. It meant taking no economic orders from them either. In a society of free and equal citizens, Americans would follow their own economic initiative. They would be as free economically as they were politically. This small government model meant the state was to interfere as little as possible in the citizen's life. Americans founded the only country ever to be based on the principle of restraining the government. And that unleashed such dynamic economic growth, it took America from a fledgling state to a world power.
So I'm not going to torture you guys more, but that's a little glimpse. A little glimpse.
Pay me to listen to this.
Right. It's pretty brutal. And believe it or not, that video has like literally hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube. And this is what they're putting out. This is what the right wing is heralding as America the Great, small government, which is ironic because they're also the ones who are pushing for the government to get involved in the decision-making processes of women's bodies, so I find that just fascinating. But Dr. Gerald Horne, one kind of topic that he touches on is this concept of small government, and this is something that is very interesting and I don't want to say unique, but it's very particular to U.S. nationalism and patriotism, where a lot of people in the United States take pride in saying we don't take orders from anybody. We believe in small government. We don't get bossed around. The best country is that country with minimal or no government. And that's how we can solve society's problems. What is your analysis and view of this point of perspective that small government is such a great thing that it will help get rid of society's ills?
Well, with regard to small government, tell that to the indigenous people of Florida, if you can find any. Because we know that after Florida was snatched illicitly from the Spanish Empire about 200 odd years ago, that the U.S. government, unleashed the Bluecoats in a wave of terror against the indigenous population, making sure that they were forced to leave their land at gunpoint, marched across the continent, many of them on the Trail of Tears, to what was supposed to be Indian territory, now the state of Oklahoma, because of course the United States government could not even keep that promise to have this reservation or Bantustan for Native Americans, and so that too was taken. So this idea of small government is just another fantasy. And with regard to free and equal citizens, I mean, what planet is this guy living on? They're about, at the time of the so-called revolution, what I call a counter-revolution, there was about 20% population of Black people, mostly enslaved. How many indigenous people, it's hard to say. Let us say hypothetically on the conservative end, it's 35%. So half the population is not included in this so-called revolution, not to mention the people of European descent who fled to Nova Scotia, to Ontario, to Quebec, across the ocean back to London, to the Bahamas. You have this ultra-rightist group, which actually goes further than myself. I'm speaking of the 3%ers. They say that only 3% of the denizens of North America were involved in the overthrow of British rule. I don't know how they came up with that figure, but that's closer to the truth than this shyster who you just had torturing us with his blather and nonsense of the United States of America. The challenge to all these U.S. patriots today, to repeat, is if 1776 was this great leap forward for humanity, why are some suggesting we're on the brink of fascism? In other words, you need a historical explanation that sheds light on the present and then may lead us into a brighter future, not this propaganda. And speaking of which, why is it that settler revolts have a very bad odor historically. Look at Algeria, for example, where you had a bloody settler revolt before independence in 1962. Look at Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where Ian Smith, look at my book on the subject if you want more detail. Ian Smith, the leader of the racists, said that they were walking the footsteps of 1776 when they tried to secede from the British Empire in November 1965 in order to set up a companion apartheid regime. So there's so much wrong with the traditional explanation for the origins of the United States of America, and it's been so deceitful and so propagandistic. It's little wonder that people are confused. It's little wonder, in fact, that when many of our liberal friends, when they try to challenge the conservative analysis, they read from the same hymn book. That is to say, they talk about how the founding fathers were so progressive. They say the conservatives are misreading history. But I think it was Audre Lorde, the late great feminist writer, who says it's going to be very difficult to tear down the master's house with the master's tools. And that's one of the clearest examples I can imagine.
I love that quote from Audre Lorde. It's something that I always bring up whenever we talk about reform and trying to work within the system. Obviously, we want to improve the living standards and conditions of our class and our people, but ultimately we need to restructure, revise what this country even means, and would the United States of America even continue to exist under a socialist system, a new system that eradicates the foundations of slavery and racism and colonialism. Me personally, as somebody from the global South, I've never identified with this concept of America and the United States. And I think that it is at its core antithetical to class struggle and to the liberation of the working class, because, you know, you can't compare American nationalism, quote unquote American nationalism, to Haitian nationalism, right? Haitian nationalism inherently has a proletarian, revolutionary, anti-colonial position within it, intrinsic to it, because the history of the Haitian Revolution is based on the liberation of an oppressed peoples against France, right? A colonist. Same with, you know, Vietnam, right? When it was called French Indochina. Same with Angola. Same, you know, all these nations of the global South. But the United States, as is not a nation, it's an empire based on corporations, on slavery. And, you know, related to that, one of the most inspiring events that I ever went to, and shout out again to our friend Margaret Prescott, who I actually went to this event with. It was Sir Hilary Beckles speaking from Barbados, speaking in Washington, D.C. about reparations and internationalizing the reparations movement, which I think is so beautiful, because it's not just in the United States. The systemic oppression of African peoples was international. The kidnapping of Africans from the African continent, taken to the Caribbean, taken to all parts of North America. This was an international racist system of oppression, and I support the global reparations movement for, you know, all African Indigenous oppressed peoples. Unfortunately, there have been some within these communities that have opposed it. One particular individual, Dr. Horne, that I'm sure you've heard of, is Thomas Soule, and he actually has a clip. I'm going to play. I know you have to head out, so this is going to be the last clip. This is him opposing slavery, opposing reparations, talking about slavery. So I'm going to play this short clip, and we'll discuss a little bit about, you know, people like Thomas Soule who act as talking heads for the right wing and the white nationalists.
Article that got a lot of attention in The Atlantic a couple of years ago called "The Case for Reparations" by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Quote, "White supremacy is a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. Reparations is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely." Close quote. And Tom Soule, who actually saw Jim Crow with his own eyes and experienced it, responds how?
It would be nice to know his evidence for what he said, just to be old-fashioned about it. No, it was a rotten system. But I don't know how we get from that to reparations. I mean, what we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
Africa, the Middle East, Asia, slavery took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere long after it was abolished in the Western countries. Right. The other thing, I have a slight sidebar in there on the history of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
The history of slavery existed all over the world for thousands of years among all sorts of people, as far back as the history of the human species goes. It's one of many evils that the left tries to localize, when in fact it is a universal evil. But more than that, as much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere.
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 Not in Africa, not in the Arabian
not
world.
in Africa in the 21st century. When Adam Smith wrote in 1776 that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished completely was Western Europe. And so this was
as late as the year this country was founded.
Yes. And so the idea that this is something that the United States had that nobody else had, or the other countries that didn't have, it's been estimated that there are more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's before and after Columbus got here.
Right.
Oh, please.
Your reaction, Dr. Horne.
Invoice after because really I need to be paid for listening to this propaganda.
I'll send you an invoice.
As the lawyers say, this guy's arguing inconsistent counts. It's like your lawyer goes to court and says, "Your Honor, my client didn't do it and he won't do it again." On the one hand, the United States is supposed to be this great leap forward for humanity, nothing else like it. Then when it gets to slavery, everybody was doing it. So why you going to jerk our chain? Everybody was doing it. But I thought you said it was a great leap forward for humanity. It was totally unique, etc. And then that's this other shell game that these Yankee propagandists engage in. Whenever Britain does something progressive, they try to act like they're British. Well, yeah, as I said, 1772, he referred to Adam Smith. London moved to abolish slavery. But they didn't move to abolish slavery in North America in 1772. As a matter of fact, they fought a war to make sure the slavery continued. So he's trying to take on the cloak of London when it's progressive, and then don the cloak, take off the cloak when he wants to talk about U.S. patriotism. No wonder people in this country are confused. And with regard to Thomas Soule himself, your listeners should know there's a long history of Black people being manipulated, or perhaps not even being manipulated. Pursuing their class interests might be a better way to put it. I mean, look at Gabriel's revolt of the enslaved in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. It was betrayed by an African. Look at Denmark Vesey's revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, about 200 years ago. It was betrayed by an African. So this old humbug of bringing out people like Thomas Soule and Clarence Thomas, which supposedly gives them more authenticity when they spout the right-wing line. I mean, come on. Anybody who knows history knows that that's just a cheap trick.
Oh man, such a good point, Dr. Horne. It's crazy. And here's the thing, guys. Like, I know, I'm torturing you guys with these clips, but there are so many people, like, believe it or not, so many people who actually listen to Thomas Soule and to listen to these talking heads for the right wing. And it's really infuriating because they sort of portray, whenever people bring up Thomas Soule, I'm like, no, you got to read Dr. Horne. He actually has the legit history of racism, of imperialism, colonialism, because Thomas Soule, like, he kind of plays this role as like, oh, I'm being countercultural, I'm being rebellious against the system. And this is something the right wing does a lot, that they make it seem like academia is filled with Marxists and communists, and they're like, oh, if you're not a communist, you can't be a professor, teacher. I've been in academic spaces. That is not true whatsoever. It is extremely hard to be any sort of variant of the left in these spaces, So, and I'm sure Dr. Horne could attest to that as well. It's very hard to operate, and that's why I tell people, support people's historians like Dr. Horne and others, because it's very rough out there to actually produce amazing scholarly work like the work that Dr. Horne does, and to be able to withstand attacks in academia, because whenever you criticize the ruling establishment like U.S. imperialism and capitalism, you're always going to be attacked. You're always going to be a target. You're never going to get the promotions or positions. So, I have a lot of respect for people like yourself, Dr. Horne, and others who actually put their perspectives out there and are not afraid to speak the word and censor themselves. So, Dr. Horne, any final thoughts from you about the 4th of July, the farce of July, before you head out? Because I know you do have to head out.
Well, if anybody's going to be around on July 4th, 2022 on WPFWFM.org, which is the Pacifica station in Washington, D.C., I'll be spending 2 hours beginning at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern, talking about these same sorts of issues. Please tune in. They're out of pledge drive, so you won't be bombarded with pledges. And I think you'll find it intriguing, and of course, spread the word.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please make sure to check out WPFW special with Dr. Gerald Horne. Please check out all of his programming. Dr. Gerald Horne is hands down one of my favorite commentators. I'd love to have you back on, Dr. Gerald Horne. And also, again, shout out to our friend Margaret Prescott, introducing me to you. And your work is amazing, Dr. Gerald Horne. I really appreciate everything you do. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cool, guys. So that was Dr. Gerald Horne. I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes and talk to you guys in the chat about 4th of July, 4th of July. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. I'm going to read some comments. If you guys have any questions for me, by the way, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can have a casual conversation about anything you want to talk about. American, quote-unquote, patriotism, the U.S. imperialism. Shout out to Comrade Big Teal. Hope to burn a flag. Dude, it's I'm so glad you say that, because one of my critiques, especially of the so-called American patriots, is that they say, anytime you burn a U.S. flag that's like ultra left, or that's synthetic left, or that's alienating the working class. If you see, I've been to protests in the global South. I've been to protests in Haiti. I've been to protests in Honduras. I've been to protests in Ecuador, all over Latin America. And you'll see people burning U.S. flags because it is just anger against this empire, the system. For us, seeing the U.S. flag, every time I drive around and I see these people waving the U.S. flag, I look at those 13 stripes, those red and white stripes, and I think of the 13 colonies, right? The colonies where these indigenous peoples were kicked out of their land, murdered, and these Euro settlers came and basically created these new entities on their lands. Those 50 stars of colonies, I do not identify with that at all. So most definitely, shout out to Comrade Erica Kane. This Juneteenth special was great too. Most definitely, thank you so much. It was so awesome to get to meet you, Comrade Erica in LA. Hope that you and Comrade Salifu can come out to LA and we can show some more. Thank you, Dr. Horne. Yeah, he's such a dope guy. Dr. Gerald Horne's books, and that's the thing. Like, another reason why I like Dr. Gerald Horne is because he has a lot of humor in his books. If you read his history books, the same way, like, he's such a good dude and funny guy. The way he talks now is the way he talks in his books. So his writing is so amazing. Thank you, Dr. Horne, for joining us on Unmasking Imperialism. Much appreciated. Shout out to Comrade Josh. Yo, so dope you got to talk to Dr. Horne. Ramiro, hope you are well, guy. Most definitely hope you're well, Josh. Shout out to you in upstate New York. Let's see if y'all have any questions. Again, please put it in the chat. Have some time. I'm not gonna go and celebrate the 4th of July later today, so I'm gonna go to that. But I have some time to chill and chat with you guys. Let's see. Black Venom. How do you think we should behave towards our comrades who call themselves patriots? Some are very kind and insightful, but seem bullheaded on that issue. Uh, that's a great question, and it's something that I deal with myself. First, I want to start off by saying that I consider myself a communist, and I believe that as a communist, as a Marxist-Leninist, as somebody who upholds the third world anti-colonial position, I think that we can't begin to talk about socialism without talking about dismantling these empires, dismantling the United States of America, dismantling the United Kingdom, dismantling France and these major empires. And I think that I consider myself, this is what I tell people, right? I consider myself a socialist patriot. I'm a proletarian patriot, but I am a patriot of the global South nations. I support Haitian revolutionary patriotism. I support Angolan and Vietnamese and Cuban and Nicaraguan and Venezuelan proletarian patriotism. But I do not believe there can be such a thing as American proletarian patriotism because America is not a nation, right? America is an empire. And usually the counterpoint to that will be, well, yes, I don't agree that America is a nation. America has had some bad things, but there are also some good people in our history. But then why are you still kind of treating it like a nation, right? Why are you still using the same colonial flag? Why are you still upholding the 50 states and oppose balkanizing quote unquote America? So I also, conversely to that, I'm also not an ultra leftist. I'm also not sectarian. I believe it's important to unite with communists of all stripes, white, black, brown. And I think there's a role for everybody in the revolution. Now, those roles look very different for everybody, right? I think that a white communist in the first world, their role in the global socialist movement is very different from the role of campesino, a peasant in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, who's actually on the forefront of revolutionary struggle. And a lot of times, I love that term. Again, shout out to you, Comrade Oni. I'm not sure if you're watching and listening, but flattening the contradictions. Like, you can't compare U.S. quote unquote patriotism to Cuban patriotism or Brazilian or African. They're two totally different contexts, right? We have the history of Cuba and Brazil and Africa is so radically different to the U.S. that you can't just copy and paste and say, oh, well, they're doing it over there, so I'm going to do it here. And Dr. Horne explained brilliantly why earlier in the stream that, the founding fathers of these other nations had a very radically different view than George Washington and some of these other guys. So the Navy boy said the flag is based on the East India Company flag, the stripes at least. Yeah, most definitely, dude. It's crazy actually. If you see the East India flag and the first U.S. flag, they are exactly the same. They have the jack. What is that shit called? The Union Jack on the top left, and then they have the stars and stripes. The U.S. is a corporation, right? The voice of the dead. It is a corporate entity. It is not a nation. It is an empire based on conquest that I would even call, demonic and evil. Just how much destruction the U.S. is responsible for around the world. Shout out to you, Sulamoon, Comrade Big Teal. It feels quite liberating to me. People like doing it. Tell the patriots that communists should side with the most oppressed always. 100%. That's always what it's about. Shout out to Comrade Salifu Mag, right on, Ramiro. Salifu's so awesome, dude. Salifu is one of my favorite comrades. What I like about Comrade Salifu is that Comrade Salifu always spits that truth, always spits fire, regardless of who's there. And Comrade Salifu really sticks to, one of my favorite groups, honestly, AAPRP, African People's Revolutionary Party, and Kwame Ture, I think has some of the most advanced understanding of Marxism, communism, adapted to African conditions, molded to the conditions of the African international proletariat. And I think Salifu is one of the comrades who, is doing such a great job at putting that out there. Let's see. So we uphold the nation for a few good folks. I'm not too sure where you're asking there, Comrade Josh, or maybe you're probably responding to somebody else. Let's see if you guys have any other questions. Josh said, hell yeah, shout out to Salifu Mac, always on that shit. Most definitely. Let's see, Comrade Big Teal. I unite with the revolutionaries. Folks don't have to be communists just because I am, but just don't be anti-communist. That I don't appreciate. Yeah, most definitely. I think as communists, we have to basically unite with as many people as we can and be non-sectarian. Obviously, when it's things like primary contradictions, right? When it's imperialism, racism, colonialism, all these different systems of oppression, like we draw the line, of course, right? We're not just going to be all kumbaya liberals with everybody, but we also have to be aware that we have to form alliances, right? And that's also kind of like my critique of some people, even within the black and brown left, who are anti-colonial, is that they have great politics, but then they're like, all white people are the devil, all white people are evil, fuck them. And it's like, dude, like in so many ways, that's not really necessary, like that's not, why give so much negative attention and so much bad energy to that? Like just focus on what you're doing, so I think it's something that we shouldn't get too wrapped up on, like send them all back to you. I'm not also of that line of thinking, me personally. Like I feel like that can get kind of ultra left at some points. Comrade Josh, a question: how do we build internationalism and socialist internationalism at that within the imperial core? That is a fantastic question. I think that part of that is understanding something that I was mentioning earlier, the difference in the roles that people play within internationalism and socialism and the revolution, right? This is something Comrade Josh and I talk about all the time, that I compare socialist revolution to a play, to theater. And in many ways, you have different roles that take place within that play. You have the leading cast, right? The main actors who are on stage, who are the protagonists of that struggle. In my opinion, the protagonists are the peoples of the third world and third world peoples in the imperial core, Asia, Africa, Latin America, objectively, mathematically, using what Marx talks about in Capital, right? I have Capital right here. Marx talks about it. The rate of exploitation, that is a formula that Marx explains in Capital Volume 1. The rate of exploitation, where he actually provides a formula for breaking down how some people are more exploited than others, right? You have exploitation of workers in the first world, of white workers in the first world, but you have the super exploitation of workers in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and also, prison labor in the US, also, migrant labor, indigenous and black workers. That is creates a qualitative difference, right? When you have a change in quantity, one of the laws of the dialectics is that when you have a change in quantity, you have a change in quality. So the relation of the workers in the global south and global south workers to capitalism is very different from the relation of white workers in the first world to capitalism, where white workers in the first world under capitalism have more of room for ascension. They feel like, if I get this extra job or this promotion or this extra certification, I can advance to become the bourgeoisie. Whereas a farm worker in Cambodia, a sweatshop worker in Honduras, a campesino in Brazil, they'll never have that possibility to reach that level of ascension under capitalism. Their relationship to the class struggle is of a completely difference in quality. And so the protagonists are going to be overwhelmingly from the global south workers, third world workers, and the people who play the supporting roles, the supporting cast, the people pulling the curtains, can be the white working class, or people who are less oppressed within that formula that Marx draws out in Capital of the theory of exploitation. So I think that there is a role for everybody, even for wealthy communists and socialists who want to take part. And I think that includes a lot of people in the imperial core. I think part of that is recognizing your role and being straight up. Like, communists in the imperial core, you're not going to, pick up an AK and dress up as a LARP, as a guerrilla fighter in fucking Times Square in New York and be like, long live communism. And, you're not going to have the same role that somebody has in the global south. Your role is going to be different, right? Your role may be sending money to the global south. It may be supporting revolutionary movements of oppressed peoples in the imperial core, but it's not going to be the sexiest role. It's not going to be the primary role or the main role, and you have to be okay with that, and that's even a conversation that happened during the Cuban Revolution, where Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, Ernesto was like, I want to be, I love Che Guevara, by the way. I even have, hold on, I don't know if you guys can see. Well, I have my Fidel tat, and then I have my Che Guevara tat right here. Che Guevara was like, I want to be at the forefront, leading one of the columns against Batista soldiers. And Fidel's like, dude, you're a doctor. Like, we need you here back at the medical clinic helping people. And it's not the sexiest role, but it's where we need you. And I think that a lot of the first world left has to have that humility to be like, hey, maybe my role is not the protagonistic role. Maybe we're not going to be up front and center. Maybe it'll be the workers of India, the 250 million who are, leading a revolt. And we're just going to be on the sidelines helping out. And there's nothing wrong with that, So I think that's a big part of it, is just admitting that there's a difference in roles, right? And we can play a role in the imperial core, but it'll look very different. Let's see what else you guys are saying. Damn, you guys have been commenting quite a bit. Big Teo AAPRP. Yeah, shout out to AAPRP. An amazing group. Let's see. Countries who actually appreciate socialist history in Africa helps folks in many countries understand imperialism. Shout out to my homie Chris Duran. The importance of freeing political prisoners connects the struggle against imperialism in external and internal colonies. Most definitely. And by the way, guys, I recently put out a video a few days ago featuring a talk by Oscar Lopez Rivera, Puerto Rican freedom fighter from Borinquen, and also Berta Zúñiga Cáceres from Honduras, the daughter of Berta Cáceres. And hearing both of them speak was amazing. In particular with Oscar, he was a political prisoner in jail for decades, just for his revolutionary political activism as a Boricua, as a Puerto Rican against U.S. imperialism and colonialism. Can you imagine somebody who spent, 30 plus years in prison trying to liberate his people from U.S. imperialism, coming out and meeting leftists who are like, oh, we have to maintain the U.S. and Puerto Rico should be part of the United States. The national liberation struggle is something that, as internationalists, as communists, we have to support and defend. And I think that any notion of maintaining the American empire is irreconcilable with liberation of oppressed colonies. Because if we're talking about self-determination and liberation of oppressed colonies, we're talking about Aztlan, right? The whole Southwest, where I'm talking to y'all from, right? California, Texas, Arizona, so many other places, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, all of the indigenous communities that are occupied right now. So I think the U.S. would cease to exist in that case. Let's see what else you guys have here. The Stephen, interesting name, the Stephen. What is the difference between revolutionary terror and adventurism within the imperial core? Revolutionary terror, you know what? I don't even know what that is, to be honest with you. I feel like revolutionary terror is like a misnomer, and I feel like it kind of sounds maybe like some anarchisty propaganda of the deed thing. I personally feel like we should avoid that term terror. Communists, as we always tell people, right? Communists are lovers of peace. We want peace by any means for our working class. It is the capitalist and imperialist system which is the biggest perpetrator of violence and terror. And that system of horror and exploitation is what produces violence and terror on a daily basis. Our working class peoples want peace and stability. They don't want terror. And I think that there can't be revolutionary terror. There can be revolutionary defense. There can be revolutionary armed struggle. I wouldn't necessarily use the term revolutionary terror and adventurism within the imperial core. Adventurism, it's doing isolated acts of quote unquote revolutionary struggle without the backing of the masses. This is something that when you first get into communism, a lot of people tend to do. They're like, let's go blow up this and do that. And it's like, dude, you're never going to win the masses over with these isolated acts of adventurism. I think it's just a way to separate yourself from the masses. Chris Duran, understanding revolutionary nationalist movements helps to build an understanding of internationalism. Let's see. Let's see what else you guys are saying. Long live the oppressed peoples of the world. Free Mumia rallies happening across the country tomorrow on the 40th anniversary of his imprisonment. Yes, Free Mumia Abu Jamal, an amazing revolutionary, Black Panther revolutionary journalist. He's somebody who I appreciate. Toby, I subscribed earlier, but just now turned on notifications. I love my revolutionary colonized YouTube. Most definitely. Thank you so much, Comrade Toby. I really appreciate you being on. Comrade Saheli, Independence from Puerto Rico. Most definitely. I definitely 100% agree with you. Viva Puerto Rico Libre. Viva Borinquen Libre. It's crazy, man. I was in Puerto Rico a few years ago visiting, and it's sad to see how colonized the island has become. People are Puerto Rico has, I was just talking about this with Ophelia, that Puerto Rico has one of the highest obesity rates and in the region. And it's because the people are being, there's a term that I heard, I think there's a book after this as well. It's called stuffed and starved, right? Like the US is importing all of this junk garbage, McDonald's, Burger King, Chili's, all this food that has no nutritious value, dumping it on the island. And so the beans and the plantains and the yuca that the people were originally eating, that will cost like $10, right? Some little avocado toast will be like $15 in Puerto Rico. And McDonald's and Burger King is like $1. And they're literally wiping out people with disease. They're gentrifying people out of the island, forcing people out. These crypto colonizers going to Puerto Rico. It's very urgent, the situation. Being in defense and solidarity with Borinquen is very important. So I think, that's very important. Josh said, Lenin speaks on terrorism a bunch and how it's not necessarily capable of bringing about revolution and tends to lead to more oppression of the peoples. 100%, man. Read Ultra-Leftism and Infantile Disorder by Lenin. Also read Socialism, Utopian versus Scientific by Engels. Very important works to really study. Chris Duran, Hugo Chavez talked about being peaceful, but armed and ready to protect the people. Most definitely, Hugo Chavez, somebody who, this is something that we have to study and we have to respect. Because even when I was first getting into communism, you would have these random dudes who were like these kind of like 14-year-old angsty teens who were like, well, Venezuela is not really socialist because they never had a violent revolution, so they're not true communists. I'm like, dude, you've never been to Venezuela. You never understand what the violence was like in Venezuela prior to the Bolivarian Revolution. The people don't want violence, and it is up to the nations, the peoples themselves, to really decide what path they want to take. And if they want to take a peaceful electoral path, that's up to them. And regardless, Venezuela is doing amazing things, even though they didn't exactly follow the model of Cuba and the Soviet Union. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. Let's see. Let's see. I'll take a few more, and then I gotta dip out. I gotta start getting ready. It's been really cool. I think I'm gonna change up the format a little bit for the streams. I'll have the guest on for the first hour, and then I'll take some questions and I'll talk with you guys in the chat afterward, just to hear what you guys are saying, because I think it's important as well to get feedback. Shout out to all of you watching and listening, by the way. I really appreciate you guys being on and just having these conversations. I think that it's important to really have these discussions about things like the 4th of July and American nationalism and all these different things, because these are conversations that are taking place, and it's important for as many people as possible to be involved in these conversations. So let's see what else you guys are saying. After show Q&A. The reactionaries in Venezuela tried to inflict a lot of violence on the revolution, doesn't just back down from it, ready for all the smoke. Yeah, the escualidos that they call them, the right wingers, backed by imperialism, backed by the European Union and the US. They were murdering people. Look at the case of Orlando Figueroa in Venezuela, a young Afro-Venezuelan man who was fucking burned alive by these right-wing escualidos in Venezuela. Insane stuff. I saw that video, man. Like, it pissed me off. It really pissed me off seeing that. And then these are the people who have the gall to be like, SOS Venezuela, pray for Venezuela. And they portray themselves as victims, and yet they're burning and lynching black and brown people, black and brown communists. So that's insane. Oh my God. Yeah, it's fucking nuts, dude. And we never hear about that. You're never going to hear about that in mainstream media. Comrade Josh, how do you envision revolutionary self-defense of oppressed peoples within the U.S. empire, especially as fascism and extreme violence are on the rise again? I am pro-gun. I am a pro-gun communist. I believe that the left should be, not even just in terms of arms, but like self-defense, martial arts. We should be healthy. We should be training. We should be ready to defend our peoples. And I disagree with the liberal notion that we have to disarm and be like these, cosmopolitan urban weaklings who are, the right wing. They're fucking, as much as I hate them and as much as I dislike their politics, they're fucking prepared when it comes to a lot of stuff. And I think that people on the left, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to stay healthy, exercise, and be ready and prepared for any situation. Nicaragua fought them counter-revolutionaries back too. All power to the people of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, and others. Most definitely, they fought the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, who were terrorizing the population of Nicaragua, the Sandinista. Long live the Bolivarian Revolution. Joe the Euro Squatter, yes, get your granny a Glock. That's hilarious. By the way, I love your name, Joe. I don't know who you are. Thank you for commenting. I've seen you comment on a few of my videos. Appreciate you watching and listening. Hilarious name. Get your granny a Glock. Let's see. I think us in the U.S. should read up a lot on the tactics of the partisans. Will probably be useful in the future with the way things are going. The partisans have a beautiful history of resisting fascism all over Europe, against the Nazis, against the Italian fascists. And most definitely, I think that there's still a role. Again, like I said earlier in the beginning, I think it's important, to emphasize that there's a role for everybody. Will that role look the same everywhere? Not at all, right? The role of the Indian Communist Party, Marxist, is going to be different from the role of a white construction worker in the U.S. when it comes to global socialism. And that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you kind of have to understand where your role is and have the humility to be okay with that, and I think that's really important. Do you think Democrats are just as racist as Republicans? Fuck yeah, of course, dude. Probably, if not even more, honestly, because a lot of the Democrats, like, and not even just Democrats, but liberals, a lot of the liberal hipster, the white liberal leftists are so racist. They're so pretentious and arrogant against our peoples. And it takes very subtle forms. Like, the thing with a lot of people on the right is that they're just overt. Like, they don't have a filter. They just say whatever they think. And it's ignorant shit. It's arrogant shit. But a lot of the liberal Democrat leftists, like, who run these NGOs and the social justice industrial complex, and they're trying to save us, they're just as racist, but it just manifests itself in a different way, like in a white savior complex. Ramiro always loves taking out the latte leftists. Hell yeah. Yeah, they're fucking whack, dude. I just been around them so long, and they're so annoying to me that I always call them out. And they're a bigger threat, honestly. I think that the liberal latte leftists who they study us well, right? They learn how we speak. They learn the words that we use. They see what we do and they learn from us, and then they commodify it. They make it into NGOs. They make it, that's why I think they're more of a threat, because they're better at learning the enemy, right? It's like, what's that slogan that Mao Zedong says, like, know your enemy. And this is something I think also Sun Tzu says this in The Art of War, know your enemy. And this is something that the liberals do very well. They study the communist movement, they study black and brown movements, and they take the best and they water it down and subjugate it to an apparatus of the DNC and the Democratic Party. So it's something that is important. Chris Duran, Ramiro is a mate Marxist. That's hilarious. Yeah, mate, by the way, for those of y'all who are watching, listening, mate is a very tasty, amazing drink, indigenous to South America, Chile, Argentina, the Mapuche people and other peoples from there. I guess since my family's from Honduras, from Central America, horchata. If you guys have had it, delicious, by the way. Horchata is really good. Horchata, I'm a horchata Marxist. So I think we'll keep it there. Thank you guys so much for joining, watching, and listening. It's been a real pleasure having you guys on. It was so great to have Dr. Gerald Horne on earlier. I'm going to try to get him back on soon. And if you guys have any suggestions or questions, always feel free to comment below or in the chat or wherever it is that you want to comment. And I'll try to do more topics. I'm hoping to do a series soon about the family dynasties of capitalism. You guys seem to have liked them, like the Rothschilds, the Sassoons, the Kadoorie family. I'm hoping to do an episode soon about the Sackler family, which is like the family behind OxyContin and painkillers and how they support Israel. And it gets really crazy. I've been doing some interesting research on that. I'm also going to have on probably soon John Potash, the author of Drugs as Weapons Against Us. He has a really good documentary out now about Big Pharma and Pfizer and the jab. So we're going to talk about that, something that's kind of controversial within the left to talk about. So thank you guys so much. Again, this was episode 84. Really appreciate you guys being on. We're going to go out to an inspiring speech by Kwame Ture, who somebody I love. I have so much respect for. I learned a lot from him. Thank you guys so much. We're going to head out with this. Peace out, guys. Have an amazing weekend. Fuck the U.S. Fuck the fourth. Long live communism. And yes, you can be optimistic and a communist, and you can be constructive and criticize the U.S. because we're going to build something even better than the U.S. So we're not pessimistic. We're not just these ultra-left Soros people. We are constructive. We are optimistic, but we recognize that there can be no socialism without quote-unquote America. Peace out, guys. Have a great weekend and take care.
Many of us feel, many of our generation feel, that they're getting ready to commit genocide against us. Now, many people say that's a horrible thing to say about anybody. But if it is a horrible thing to say, then we should do as Brother Malcolm says, we should examine history. The birth of this nation was conceived in the genocide of the red man. Genocide of the red man. Of the red man. In order for this country to come about, the hunky had to completely exterminate the red man, and he did it. And he did it. He did it. And he did it where he does not even feel sorry, but he romanticizes it by putting it on television with cowboy and Indians. Cowboy and Indians. If you do not think he's capable of committing genocide against us, check out what he's doing to our brothers in Vietnam. Check out what he's doing in Vietnam. We must develop an undying love as is personified in Brother Huey P. Newton. If we do not do that, we will be wiped out. Our slogan will become, first, our people, then, and only then, me and you as individuals. Our people first. Our people first. The concept of a black man is one who recognizes his cultural, his historical, and the roots of his great ancestors who were the greatest warriors on the face of this earth. Africa.